Thinking back to the cries of, "This is not my Star Trek!" In the band world, there actually is an opportunity to claim an individual band as your own, or at the very least, to credibly feel like you really do have some stake in it, since once upon a time you did play or march in it, and it really was much closer to being yours. The challenge is to grasp that when you're an alum, it's now somebody else's, namely the folks actually in it now. As an alum, it's your band, and it isn't. Schrodinger's band, I guess. Hello, and welcome to episode 47 of the BandWagon podcast for the week of February 3rd, 2025. On this edition of the program, news and notes from the band world, including a band story that involves the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, some thoughts about the Star-Spangled Banner, a story from the great Noel Casler, and my personal Venn diagram circles of band and science fiction intersect. I'm your host, Rob Hammerton. Hello, dear listener. I've got a number of very interesting trio section conversations in the works, and I look forward to offering those up to you quite soon. But curiously, late last week I was listening to another of my usual podcast destinations, and the conversation that the three co-hosts were having spoke to me in several contexts, not least of which was, yeah, that often applies to the band activity, and in this environment of internet commentary that cares not whom it damages, it's worth talking about. So I shall. But first, put new batteries in your stand light, and away we go. Let's play the first strain. In this episode's first strain, news and notes from the band world. Dateline Lawrence, Kansas. The University of Kansas has named Dr. Melissa Sawyer as its permanent assistant director of bands following her completion of a Doctor of Musical Arts degree in wind conducting at KU. Sawyer, originally from Edmond, Oklahoma, holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in music education from the University of Oklahoma and a Master of Arts in wind conducting from New Mexico State University. Sawyer served as the assistant director of bands at New Mexico State, where she was assistant director of the marching band and symphonic band. Before that, she taught middle school, high school, and collegiate band programs in Oklahoma, Texas, Nevada, New Mexico, and Kansas. Dateline, West Lafayette, Indiana. The Indianapolis Motor Speedway has installed a brick in its Pagoda Plaza in honor of Dr. J. Gebhardt as he completes 19 years as director of the Purdue All-American Marching Band. Gephardt's history with the Speedway includes working with Jim Nabors, Florence Henderson, and other artists. He will continue at Purdue as the Al G. Wright Chair of Bands and Orchestras. And that's news and notes from the band world for this week. If you have a news item you think should be included in this segment, send me a link via email to heybandwagon@yahoo.com. After this quick break, some thoughts about the national anthem. This is BandWagon. Okay, let's pick it up at the second strain. In this week's second strain, as I suggested in this week's opening, this is not a political podcast or a current events-y one, apart from stories about speedway bricks and such. But as with everything and everyone in this world, we are in this world. This podcast's advertising tagline is a resource and a refuge for band geeks. And as I have said before, I know that there are listeners who come to this program with that in mind, and they come to it looking forward to maybe not being faced with the news of the day for an hour or so. I really do. So this story is going to be about this world, but mostly about band, per usual, I promise. A couple of weeks ago, the community band, which I have the genuine pleasure of conducting, held its first rehearsal of the program year. We finish our December holiday caroling gigs and take a frankly well-deserved 3 or 4 weeks off before reconvening mid-January to stuff our spring and summer music folders full of new goodies and old favorites, and then to set off on a new round of rehearsals to prepare for mid-year gigs. I may have spoken before in this space about the attraction of the community band activity to a lot of its participants, and the Neshoba Valley Concert Band is, I suspect, no different, in that it can be an opportunity to similarly shut out the rest of the world and just make music with like-minded people, or at the very least with people who share our love of playing in a band. Now, for quite a number of people, the first fortnight of this particular new presidential administration has been more stressful to watch than the average. No presidential administration is universally loved or universally reviled, but a large percentage of the American population, and therefore a band's membership, probably has an opinion about it and the way that it begins. Decisions and policy announcements and executive orders and such like. For some people, the time since January 20th has been one of anticipation of a new set of policies. For others, it's one of trepidation or more. And as the director of an ensemble that I suspect has a range of opinions about this sort of thing, I'm mindful of the tightrope that I walk. I walk the same tightrope when I'm in front of my church choir. And when I taught high school band and chorus and jazz band and rock band, I walked that tightrope too. I use the phrase, I suspect, when speaking of community band members I work with, because not only do I obviously not talk politics or current events during rehearsals, because again, selfishly, we ain't got time, we're preparing music here, but I also don't tend to talk about that stuff much, if at all, even during mid-rehearsal breaks or beforehand or afterward. It's been that way in the 2.5 years I've been with the group. I can't decide whether this is on purpose or what, but even though I can suspect that I know who probably voted for whom, well, started thought, never assume anything, and I don't. So, before that first community band rehearsal, as it happened, I emailed to the group a list of items we would probably look at during rehearsal, as I always do. It's a good idea to give percussion folks an idea of what's coming so they can fetch all the right percussion toys after all. And I thought that we should first play through something we already knew before digging into the new stuff. So I chose our arrangement of the Star-Spangled Banner. I will confess to you that, I knew it would be just 2 days after the inauguration, but I didn't really think about what the implications could be of playing down the national anthem 2 days after an event about which, frankly, a lot of people I know were pretty ripped up. Not that you can avoid that. Again, the results of every presidential election tend to disappoint somebody. I only really thought about the potential minefield I'd laid for myself after we'd played through the thing. As it happens, we have many solid players in the ensemble, and the ones that have joined us over this past year have definitely added to the quality of the sound. Add to that the band members' familiarity with not just the tune, but our particular arrangement, which is one that this arranger admits to being pretty proud of, and you end up with a really nice band sound to start 2025. But there was every possibility that somebody was going to murmur something after the last chord released, or that someone would engage me in conversation as we were packing up to head home, perhaps commenting that it just kind of took them out of the band rehearsal moment and back into the big world of stressful news to play the national anthem, and why did I inflict that on them? Turns out no. After we finished playing it, we listened to that last chord ring a bit, and then we turned our attention to the next thing, and everything seemed fine. And believe me, and I say this with genuine affection for the group, if someone had been bent out of shape about it, they'd have talked to me or emailed afterward. I promise you, these people are not reticent about offering me their 2 cents, and frankly, I'd rather have it that way than wonder what they were thinking. I really would. Sometimes it's more immediately stressful, but, well, the verb fester springs to mind, and that's more poisonous, trust me. At the start of my 3rd year of teaching music at Uxbridge High School, back in the early 2000s, a little thing called 9/11 happened. And it was an opportunity for this relatively new teacher to talk with his students about it, and about repercussions, and about a lot of stuff, not least of which was the important role that music can play in, soothing wounds, both individual and collective. And I remember saying to them something along the lines of, I feel like I have to say this in this moment, but I also feel like there's no need to say this generally because you all know this already, but I also feel like it's worth saying at all times and any time. In this ensemble, no matter who you are, no matter what you look like, no matter what instrument you play, no matter whether you read music well or somewhat or not at all, no matter what, when you are on this stage, you are important, you are welcome, and you are safe. At my community band rehearsal a couple of weeks ago, I didn't say any of that, at least not in words. I can only hope that the environment I've tried to foster in my 2+ years as conductor is just that, one where everyone feels important and welcome and safe. Actions speak louder than words, goes the old aphorism, and I guess that's the approach I've taken, consciously or not. It's what I would want if somebody else were conducting and I were sitting there playing my sax. So, yeah, we just finished the national anthem and then set off into the New Year's repertoire. And as just about always happens, the tone of the conversations that burst out at the end of the rehearsal as we packed up and headed out, that tone was a merry one. And I think that was okay. With that, I'll pause again for a moment and then return with some extended thoughts about band and Star Trek. No, I'm not kidding. Okay, let's change keys and get into the trio section. This week in the trio section, not my usual interview, but instead, as promised, something of a different trio section. Now, I carve out a lot of podcast time for the trio so that I can delve into band-related topics with friends or colleagues or new friends of mine. In a way, this week is no different in that I'm about to do a deep dive. Now, I'm not having a conversation with myself, and I'm not creating a dialogue between me and some fictional character or anything. Although 9 years ago almost, as the actor Leonard Nimoy was in the final stages of his fight with COPD, and then did eventually succumb to it, I wrote a piece for my blog which was an imagined dialogue between me and the character Mr. Nimoy was most famous for, the emotionless, logical Vulcan science officer of the USS Enterprise, Star Trek's Mr. Spock. And my bringing up that little piece of fan fiction is not an accident. Here we go. 10 days ago, as this episode drops, the Paramount Plus television streaming service premiered a new Star Trek production. It was a one-shot, 90-minute, almost feature film called Section 31. Right off the bat, you do not need to know what Section 31 is. In fact, you really don't need to know what Star Trek is to grasp the thrust of today's symposium. But I'll fill in a gap or two, partly because this is one of the topics other than band that I enjoy nerding out about, and partly because I think there's an available analogy about to be laid out which actually will inform the eventual endgame of this week's trio section. Star Trek is a story about an almost utopian future for humanity, which involves space travel and interaction with new life and new civilizations, and at first was centered on the exploits of the Starfleet vessel USS Enterprise and its gallant crew, and after a while it began to tell stories of people other than that gallant crew, which did cause many of its fans to squawk a bit because, hey, Star Trek is about Kirk and Spock and McCoy, and where did these Picard and Data and Counselor Troy people come from? And this isn't Star Trek! No! No! Sorry, didn't mean to go down that road, but it's not an insignificant road. And yes, I did actually mean to go down it. So that's the basic idea of Star Trek. No matter how wild the galaxy probably is, Star Trek is showing you the civilized, moral, ethical, optimistic, basically good Starfleet guys wearing sharp and dignified uniforms and exploring the universe for the greater good, exemplifying the best that humanity can be. In fact, regularly recurring Star Trek characters were imagined by their creator, Gene Roddenberry, to be such upstanding citizens, and humanity was imagined by Roddenberry to have evolved to such an elevated moral and psychological state, after having survived World War III, that there was in fact absolutely no interpersonal conflict betwixt them. Now, knowing humans as you and I do, I think you'll agree with me that in no reality is that possible for human beings. As the Bible doesn't really say, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there are at least 2 or 3 opinions. And also, having a cast of characters that have no interpersonal conflicts makes for some really dull storytelling. Okay, so that's the Trek thing basically. Zap guns and spaceships, yes, but it's science fiction, so we're trying to make commentary on the state of the world without letting on that that's what we're doing. You're wondering when the band part comes in. I promise it's coming. But first, the other half of the filling in of the gap I was doing. Section 31. In a spin-off series of Star Trek, I'm pretty sure it was Deep Space Nine, but it doesn't matter. And I can hear the Deep Space Nine fans sitting up straight and saying, hey, it sure does. For just a second. There was created a guest character who was a little, as the kids say, sus. And he turned out to be a representative of a little-known organization within Starfleet called Section 31. In short, Section 31 is the Starfleet and United Federation of Planets version of the CIA. Or if you like, it's an organization not unlike the Men in Black, but with far less of a sense of humor. Their mission, their purpose, is to deal with threats to the Federation that the Federation often didn't even know about, and do it in a quiet, unobtrusive manner. And crucially to all this, they carry out that mission using methods and maneuvers that sometimes bend moral and ethical rules. Which is not really what Starfleet's setup is, and it's not what the original Federation founding documents had in mind. But just as the CIA exists, so does Section 31. Good so far? I promise, that is all you need to know from out of the science fiction convention, worst episode ever sort of world. And there's a reason I bring that little Simpsons reference up too. Okay, so I've gotten you back to the premiere of the Section 31 movie. When it was announced, plenty of people thought, ooh, they're going to make a standalone movie about the shadowy and ethically all over the place spy organization that operates within Starfleet but also outside of its oversight, apparently. Cool. It's going to be like James Bond in space, but without the cheesy Roger Moore jokes. And maybe, we hope, with some mature discussions of ethical boundaries, the kind of thing science fiction, and Star Trek particularly, have done real well a lot of times. And also, we expect that it will look and sound great, and the acting will be great, and there will be no flaws whatsoever in it, according to our understanding of what Star Trek is, because even though a story like this about an organization like this must logically be very different from well-coiffed space explorers tooling around in a starship that looks like a gigantic dental clinic, we would like it to be exactly what we're expecting, please and thank you. Or else. And, like any project which has pretty high expectations assigned to it, fairly or not, and which doesn't meet those expectations, in the eyes of some of its consumers, fairly or not, whether it asks for those expectations to be assigned or not, disappointment is inevitable. And it seems like in the last, decade or two, the expression of that disappointment has gone from merely strident to unquestionably toxic. Not all of it, #NotAllFans, but enough of it to make interacting online with fellow devotees of one's favorite activity maybe not 100% universally enjoyable. That decade or two of online comic book guy opining coincides, coincidentally, with the rise of social media, or maybe not coincidentally whatsoever. The podcast that I said I was listening to back in this week's introduction, do you remember the introduction? It's produced by an online group called Trek Culture. Now, Trek Culture is a subdivision of the larger What Culture company, which produces video and other internet content about pop culture franchises. There are other subdivisions of What Culture that deal with Doctor Who, professional wrestling, TV, films, music, video games, and board games. I can't speak for the other subdivisions, but the Trek Culture group seems like a pack of very cheerful, entertaining, and if I may say so, doggedly fair-minded people. They really do tread the line between reviewers and company shills very, very well. They produce a video series called Ups and Downs, where they give an overview of a recent Star Trek episode or film or other project, with spoiler warnings attached, and throughout their summary of the story, they pause and mention moments that they liked for whatever reason and call them ups, and moments that they didn't like so much, they call downs. On-screen graphics keep a running tally of the ups and downs, and at the end of the overview, to quote Whose Line Is It Anyway, the points don't matter. The whole idea is, here's what we thought, you're welcome to agree or disagree, because we're all here to chat about the Trek we just saw, and to do so in a civilized manner. Just like Starfleet, and less like Section 31. I'll cut to the chase. The reviews for the Section 31 movie throughout the Trek fandom corner of the internet have been almost universally poor. The commentary has assessed just about every element of the production and found them all wanting. Direction, acting, optical effects quality, story concept, specific dialogue, character development, character arcs, character costumes, just about everything has taken hits of various velocities and ferocities. So, I downloaded the Trek Culture podcast, eager to hear their take, while bearing in mind my understanding that those folks are very glass half full, very realistic yet at least guardedly optimistic, very, hey, at the end of the day, we love Star Trek and want to support it so that the corporate powers that be will understand that we want more of it, not more Trek projects canceled because the fandom hates it. It was clearly a very difficult podcast for them to record. The Trek Culture folks include, first, a very Irish fellow named Sean Ferrick, who has become the chief voice for the Trek Culture channel, and who signs off at the end of each of his channel's videos with something like, "Yous are all awesome, yous are all wonderful, please be good to each other, live long and prosper, and above all, be kind," in a delightful Irish brogue that I shall not attempt to recreate here because, dear listener, I care about you. Next, a dour Englishman named Tom Roberts Finn, who does quite a bit of video editing for the channel as well, and can be counted on to give Trek episodes fewer stars out of 10 than the rest of them. He's definitely the Eeyore of the group. Next, a bouncy Englishwoman named Ellie Littlechild, whose main gig was the Doctor Who subdivision of What Culture until a couple of years ago when she was added to the Trek subdivision cast without ever having been a Trekkie. She represents the newbies very well. Her favorite Trek series turns out to be Star Trek Voyager, about which many fans have gnashed their teeth, but she is resolute, and she has that right. And finally, this episode included an American fellow named Mick Jost, who is an infrequent enough guest Trek Culture podcast voice that I don't know much about him, other than he fits in well with the group because his opinions are always very considered and very evidence-backed. And they all, to varying degrees, were struggling with how to convey their disappointment with the Section 31 movie. If I were to try and boil down their commentary into one sentence, it would be this: what a missed opportunity. Now, their specific thoughts aren't terribly crucial to this trio section extended commentary of mine. You probably don't care that the main character is revealed to have murdered her whole family in an early flashback sequence, but that the rest of the characters seem to give her a pass. You probably don't care that the various clandestinely operating spy organization members comprising this particular Section 31 impossible mission-style team appear and behave throughout the movie in ways that would get them noticed by everybody in the room, which is kind of not the goal of a secret agent, is it? And on and on. And I'm not going to get into the Irish accent utilized by one of the non-Irish actors, which vastly offended the authentically Irish Trek Culture podcast host Sean. Nor am I going to dwell too much on that actor's character being a Vulcan, just like Mr. Spock, but a wildly theatrically emotional one, not remotely like Mr. Spock. The upshot of the upshot was, you didn't tell a Section 31 story, and you didn't tell it in a way that was recognizably Star Trek. And that upshot was largely what the online fan commenters have gone with too. Except that, as has been common for a long time, not only did those online commenters cry out, "This is not Star Trek," but they also cried out, "This is not my Star Trek." Not just not my idea of what I understood Star Trek to be, based on what I've seen so far, which is in a way a legitimate critique if you never want Star Trek to try new things ever, like base your story on a non-moving space station or hurl a starship crew many thousands of light years from home or anything like that. But rather, not my Star Trek, as in this belongs to me, singular. Not even this belongs to the fan base, which it doesn't, it belongs to Paramount, y'all. But the rather self-centered idea that my idea of what Star Trek is and ought to be is the only one that matters. Okay, this reference is for the diehard Trek fans out there, so my apologies to the non-Trekkers. Did any of those pretty possessive Trekkies ever hear of infinite diversity and infinite combinations? No. The difference between the Trek Culture folks and some, not all, but some of the online commenters, whether they've produced their own video reviews or just left remarks in the infamous comment sections, has been that of tone. You will not be surprised to learn this. And you will not be surprised to learn that not only the Trek Culture folks, but the actual cast and crew and production team of the Star Trek franchise has been stung by some of that tone. About 12 minutes into this 90-minute podcast, which is about twice the length of their usual, that's how much they had to say, and how much they wrestled with how to say it, Mick Jost, the American, talked about Star Trek executive producer Alex Kurtzman. In a recent interview, Kurtzman was asked if he knew anything about the next theatrical Star Trek release, and he said that he really didn't know anything because he was only involved in the Paramount Plus streaming service side of the franchise, not the film side. Which was startling because Kurtzman has been executive producer of every Star Trek project since the movie reboot in 2009, which starred Chris Pine and Zoe Saldana, and his tenure has included the much-maligned Discovery series, the Strange New Worlds series, and the animated Prodigy and Lower Decks series. He's been the franchise gatekeeper really for 16 years. And at that point in the conversation, Ellie Littlechild chimed in and wondered, could Kurtzman be feeling a little fatigued about having been in the crosshairs incessantly for a solid decade and a half? I mean, yes, as an artist producing works of art that other people will perceive, you kind of sign up for critique of your work, up or down. But, she asked, are the toxic complaints from the rabid wing of Trek fandom finally getting to him? Sean Ferrick noted that the Star Trek Discovery cast has said in interviews that yes, as filtered as that online commentary is, yes, of course some of it gets through, and yes, of course they see some of it, and yes, of course, that hurts. What toll does that take on a person? Sean quipped, at the risk of being called a shill, be good, people. I've talked Trek enough to get you the idea, and maybe enough that I shouldn't do so anymore, like throughout the entire future of the BandWagon podcast. And by now, I bet you absolutely know where I'm going with this. In the band world, this toxic online commentary is most commonly experienced, I would guess, by the drum and bugle corps community. You might correct me on this, but if I'm right about that, I can imagine that it's because, compared with college bands and community bands and service bands and concert bands and wind ensembles that belong to academic institutions, drum corps is the most competitive. I mean, in terms of first place, second place, third place, in terms of, well, an environment in which the points do matter. And in terms of corps alumni who rightly look forward to seeing their former organization continue to do well, or drum corps fans who never marched but who have been supporters of particular groups for years or decades, but who may disagree with each other and with the current leadership of those groups about just what doing well sounds and looks like. Thinking back to the cries of, "This is not my Star Trek!" In the band world, there actually is an opportunity to claim an individual band as your own, or at the very least, to credibly feel like you really do have some stake in it, since once upon a time you did play or march in it, and it really was much closer to being yours. The challenge is to grasp that when you're an alum, it's now somebody else's, namely the folks actually in it now. As an alum, it's your band, and it isn't. Schrodinger's band, I guess. As has been noted in this podcast space, in their heart of hearts, a band or corps alum always wants to go back and hear their alma mater group and think, they're better than we were, and that's good. Better that way than thinking, ooh, they've backslid. Cringe. We do not want that, if we're honest, I think. On top of which, sometimes improvement is in the eye of the beholder. In one of BandWagon's early dogfights, I mentioned a Facebook group whose members' whole purpose seemed to be wishing that drum corps was like it used to be when they marched, even if that meant 2 or 1 valve G bugles, and drill that always started on the goal line, and totally symmetrical drill all the time, and timpani being carried on the field. And I have now revealed my own biases just with my tone of voice, and yeah, I get it. So the Star Trek actors go on press junkets leading up to the red carpet premiere of the project, which they spent a great deal of time and energy on. I mean, it's their occupation. They get to make money doing what they love to do. And they talk about how great the experience was and how well they all got along and how happy they were with the final product. And I know, on a press tour, you're only supposed to say good things, but there's every possibility that regardless of whether the movie ends up being a turkey, those people really did have a great experience, and they really did get along, and they really are happy with the final product. Partly because they know what it took to make it happen at all, and partly because they looked at it afterward and said, yep, cool, it's what we meant. So when the Blue Devils start wearing uniforms that involve the color pink, and when the community band puts away the Broadway medley which they've been doing for eons in a row, just because the conductor thinks it's time to explore new medleys, and no, this is not my personal story, but it's a likely one somewhere, and when the college band's new director isn't the one that a lot of alumni thought should have gotten the gig, and yes, that's a story that I was very close to, and a lot of my dear listeners were as well, and isn't the passage of time a revealing thing? Well, different people react differently. And different people who react poorly express themselves differently. You'll be unsurprised to know that I much prefer listening to something like the Trek culture folks reviewing a film they were frustrated with than reading the online comments of people who unfortunately come off as personally hurt and offended because a Trek movie didn't meet their specific hopes, sometimes their impossible demands, to the point that they say things like, Section 31 is the death of Star Trek. Yep, that got said. Sorry, but the Star Trek franchise survived Star Trek V. And yeah, that's my opinion. So there's a way to react poorly to something you've viewed or heard that can still reveal you as a decent human, frankly. At the end of the Trek Culture podcast episode, Sean Ferrick and Tom Roberts-Finn addressed the people who watched their group's ups and downs videos compared to other folks' video reviews, noting the difference, namely, we're not saying this is a bad film, period, just that here are some things that worked for us, and here are some things that didn't work for us. They really bent over backwards to insist that, well, as a good friend of mine once said, opinions are like armpits. Everybody's got them, and sometimes they stink. Roberts-Finn began with a rueful chuckle, and Ferrick chimed in shortly thereafter.
We tell a lot of people how to use their brains on this podcast, don't we?
We do, and I'm sure there'll be somebody going like, don't you tell me what to do? And you're absolutely right. What we will do is, I'm going to sound like my dad, I'm not telling you how to think, I'm just asking you to think. And on that incredibly patronising note, Ellie and Tom, thank you so much.
Clearly, and you saw it coming down Broadway with its doors open, probably. My point here is, this is applicable to the band world as well. We all have hot takes on what we hear and see. The thing to bear in mind, I think, is this. To paraphrase the character Dot, famously played by Bernadette Peters in the Stephen Sondheim musical Sunday in the Park with George, there is someone in this band uniform, like an actual human being who is playing, marching, designing, teaching a band show, or who is playing, conducting, programming a band concert, or who is deciding what the new uniform should look like, or who is deciding what gigs to play and what parades to not participate in, and who is doing some or all of that the best they know how, with the best of intentions for the group and for the activity and for the people in it. And as difficult as it can be sometimes, we do need to consider the probability that they're not getting into bands and drum corps and wind ensembles for the nefarious purpose of tearing down the organization or the activity from the inside. We've seen what that looks like in other contexts lately, and in contrast, it will be the decent thing to do to play the long game. Knee-jerk reactions can't take into account the whole picture and the grand sweep of time. Sometimes first impressions are right on, and in no way should that band have attempted to play that genre of music on Memorial Day. Other times, well, maybe pregame is okay with all that new extra stuff in it. In rehearsal with my community band, sometimes I'll say, I don't pit one community band against another, because this is not a competition. But I did watch a bunch of YouTube videos of bands playing the same piece we're working on. There were bands that we stack up well next to, and there are some that we can aspire to be. But in terms of intonation, blend, balance, or whatever, I like how we're doing at the moment. But I don't go to the videos of the bands whose intonation is kind of tough in spots and berate them in the comment section. There's a time and a place for critique, and there probably are more times for, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Or, if you must say something, just don't start with the word actually. In any case, the ways we express our knee-jerk reactions and our considered opinions about band or about Star Trek stand a very good chance of having impacts up or down on the actual human beings that are actually doing the work. And if the impact is a down, by which I mean born not out of constructive criticism but selfishly driven complaint, or worse, abuse, that's not helpful in multiple ways. After all, yet again, if we band people don't support each other, who the heck will? Anyway, I do appreciate you, dear listener, taking this little excursion with me. Well, not so little. That's my extended thought for this trio section, and in the words of someone whom I wouldn't mind being friends with at all, yous are all awesome, yous are all wonderful, please be good to each other, live long and prosper, and above all, be kind. Still no Irish accent here, nope. On the other side of this next break, a story about a very famous person told by a somewhat famous person that is nonetheless about band. You'll be pleased to know. Hope you'll stay with me. Here comes the dogfight. In this week's dogfight, a little bit of recognition that next Sunday, the day before episode 48 will drop, is what? Right, the Super Bowl! I'm going to retell a story that was told on Twitter most of 4 years ago, and at the time I took a screenshot of it, thinking, this might be useful someday. Sure enough, unfortunately all that did was to reinforce my tendency to be a pack rat. Anyway, the story was told by the sometime stand-up comedian and production assistant Noel Casler. Casler is probably most famous for telling all kinds of stories about his time as a talent wrangler behind the scenes at the old Apprentice game show, and for never having been challenged about the veracity of any of those stories, or even attacked on Twitter by the subjects of those stories, which suggests to me that those stories would withstand any kind of lawsuit related to non-disclosure agreements, which causes me to trust the source. He tells many more stories than just those. He's 1 degree of separation away from a whole lot of very famous people, and this particular story, which I shall tell now, is no exception. Casler wrote this. I was lucky enough to work on a few shows with Prince, most significantly the Super Bowl in Miami. I had done the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and some other shows before that, but what I loved about Prince is he was not just the most talented at whatever instrument he felt like picking up. He was a champion of the talent in others and surrounded himself with excellence. On Super Bowl 41, it was Prince who requested the Florida A&M University Marching Band to perform with him on Purple Rain. He worked on the arrangement with their director, and every note they played was magic. FAMU was my talent assignment that year, and they spent hours upon hours in the lot behind the stadium making sure it was perfect. And when they marched on the field in the rain, they shined and helped Prince shine. The power of his performance that night is now legendary, but it was in the collaboration and lifting up of others that his true legacy was felt. That's how I remember Prince, a man with so many natural gifts, but he wasn't afraid to share them and share in the spotlight. A true genius and a loss that will never be replaced. Noel Casler wrote that tweet on the 5th anniversary of Prince's death, which was April 21st of 2016. Okay, one last grand pause, and then we'll wrap things up for the week. Thanks for continuing to listen. To wrap up this week, let's take the CODA. For the CODA this week, a brief quote that I saw some time ago on social media somewhere, and sadly, whoever created the graphic failed to credit the author, so apologies to the author, but I'm going to hijack it too. Here it is. The true purpose of arts education is not necessarily to create more professional dancers or artists. It's to create more complete human beings who are critical thinkers, who have curious minds, who can lead productive lives. I kind of feel like, especially with an eye toward the critical thinking aspect of that quote, the band activity can't help but be full of those folks. And I kind of feel like, in the larger world, we're going to need to do anything and everything we can to rebuild that. That's BandWagon for this week. Thanks as always for downloading and listening. BandWagon was written, researched, and produced by your humble host. Musical interludes were produced by Hammerton Media, from source material largely by John Philip Sousa. You can listen to more episodes at the pod's website, heyband.podbean.com. Please give me feedback, let me know what you like or what you think might change. You can do that by using the email address heybandwagon@yahoo.com, or leave a 90-second voice message by going to speakpipe.com/heybandwagon. Be aware that I do reserve the right to include your message on the podcast unless you say otherwise. Those contact links and links to this week's news items and conversation topics can be found in our show notes, as can a link to BandWagon's merch store thanks to the good folks at TeePublic. Please share the show on social media, and thank you for that. If you enjoy this podcast, please do share it in the direction of someone whom you think might not be a listener yet. Word of mouth really is the best recruiting tool. And to keep up with the pod every week, subscribe to BandWagon on the Podbean app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever fine podcasts are sold. For now, take care, stay in touch, stay in tune, and we'll do this all again next week. I'm Rob Hammerton. Live long and prosper.
Damn it, Jim, what the hell's the matter with you?